We are live on LinkedIn and YouTube. Our topic today is war and oil prices. Again, again is coming from Professor Cleveland Jones. This is Professor Cleveland Jones, international consultant, researcher, and advisor for geopolitics and energy industry. Welcome, Professor Cleveland Jones.
It's always great to speak with you, especially on hot topics like this.
This is a hot topic. It really is. I have one slide only to start our conversation. It's related to the quantity of barrels per day Middle East is exporting nowadays. Only 15 million barrels a day compared to the world consumption of 100 million barrels a day. So the influence of this region in terms of oil consumption is not so big, Professor.
Yeah,
What do you think about it?
yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it because we have to remember when we looked at prices back in the 73s and so on, um, OPEC was much more preponderant in world supply and exports and so on. And also, we obviously had a very different world back then. We had war coming off Vietnam War and all these, but this is a situation that has evolved beyond the Cold War. We leave that behind. Now we have a new reality, polarized again. Um, I wanted to share a screen here
Sure.
because a while back we showed this, and this is from a very respected World Economic Forum. You know, they analyzed severe risks in the world and so on. Look, number 10, geoeconomic confrontation and this kind of thing. Their concern is that all these green things, sure, social unrest and so on, environmental damage. Look, even very recently, this is just a couple of years ago, we weren't ready to start talking about wars again. You know, so this is a relatively recent, a couple of years ago, ever since the invasion of Ukraine and so on. So this is a new scenario. Definitely, the world is catching up, but it came upon us relatively quickly. So,
So
uh,
you mean that war was not considered as a critical point at that time?
yeah, a lot of analysts were discussing risks for companies, and they were focused on environmental risks, climate change, and
Climate
so
change.
on. Oh, social pressures, and they forgot that the world is living in crisis. Even back
Yes.
then, we had crises in Africa, but there it didn't count, so people weren't looking at things so hard. But when you get into the Middle East, you get into Europe with Ukraine, then things change. But we forgot, and we shouldn't have forgotten, that
Mhm.
that the world is full of conflicts and they can explode all the time. In fact, right now we're talking about the Middle East is a very hot topic because everybody is worried about an explosion in uncontrolled reactions, that kind of thing. Personally, I think you and I both agree that there is a continuum of probabilities. And there's a very little probability that they're going to sign a peace agreement tomorrow, and very little possibility that they're going to exchange atomic bombs tomorrow. But in between, there's a lot of room for a lot of conflict, not so bad, worse, and horrible, even without a full-out war. So there's a continuum, and all of these things happening don't mean that there's only one chance. It's a continuum, and we have to analyze how far these go. But if we look at this, we miss the big picture. You know, beyond the Middle East, we have conflicts in many continents. In Africa, as we mentioned, in Asia, there's conflicts, Southeast Asia, within countries, we have conflicts. Even in Latin America, we have conflicts, some, for example, from coexistence with drug cartels. But those are conflicts and they can explode once you get into actions that affect government entities where a lot of people die. Then people pay attention, but those are simmering there all the time. So we have to get used to looking at the big picture and not ignoring something just because, there's 100 or 1,000 people dying. These are things that can grow. But in
But
this,
Professor,
yeah,
please let me interrupt you because price did not increase as expected. It's still in 80s
yeah,
levels, not 100, 200, things like that.
I tell you, back in 2000 and I think it was 17 or something, uh, Professor Diamantino and I wrote a seminal paper, and we were foreseeing a band of prices that could have spikes, but not trends way above 100 or way below 80 or 70 at the time. So, $30 is a big band, but if you're making forecasts for 10 or 15 years, which is what ended up happening, you have to have a relatively wide band, and we have that. And indeed, we're holding to that. Yes, we had spikes and so on, but it's very important to realize that the extreme price movements that many were talking about didn't really happen, and certainly I think there's a very small chance that they will to the extremes. But again, everything is a probability continuum from very high prices and low probability to very low prices and low probability, and somewhere in the middle there's a higher probability. But on the very, very short term, we know there's price volatility. That can happen. Um,
And how do you see what's worse, sanctions or war threats?
uh, Sanctions can be bad, and they are bad in unintended consequences. Wars, of course, unexpected results because it's very difficult to see where things go. But I think we now have a little of both. So we're in a situation that's not very comfortable, but we're in that middle that I mentioned, not in the extreme. So we have some problems with sanctions that are affecting Europe. They're certainly affecting, for example, LNG in Russia. But it's not horrible. Not even Russia is suffering a lot from that. And we have war effects, but even the effects from war, they passed those effects in Europe more or less with flying colors. Yeah, prices went up, they already came down. But we have underlying things, choke points. Those are not being spoken about now. We spoke about choke points, I don't know, last year or sometime, and we
Mhm.
pointed out there's many that could be important and they could flare up. Maybe more importantly, those choke points can cut off the easy flows of oil to the countries that are major importers, and that can hurt a lot. Maybe over a longer period than the very short period of a conflict. A month during a conflict, you get very worried about it, but you can more or less overcome that. But if you have a problem with choke points, that can last longer. And we discussed this choke points that have a lot of oil traveling through them. We discussed that OPEC is exporting significant amounts, but nowadays those amounts are much, much smaller than 15% of the total consumption, and some choke points are 30% of demand. So that's a concern. Yeah.
Yeah.
But one other way of looking at things is this is all over the world. We're focusing on the Middle East because that's hot now. We were focused in Ukraine a while back and are concerned about, maybe things getting out of control. But it's out towards the Far East, there's a lot of problems. And, any day, meaning in the next few years, we could also have the same concerns with Taiwan or with individual actions by separatists and so on in many of these areas. So this is a concern, not necessarily for production or supply, but for the flow. Because the important thing is you can produce it, but if you can't get it to market, that's horrible. And this is what we're talking about as the danger.
Professor, sorry to interrupt you again. These most of price spikes could be attributed to the U.S. internal production and China reduction of activity, something like that? Is it make sense for you?
If you look back in history, I mean, back to the 1970s, this graph like this, you see all these spikes, and you say each one, yes, associated with things, in particular with conflicts. A big trend was the Iran-Iraq war, where you had a very large spike that lasted a long time. That's a very harmful event. And then you had the Gulf War that had a spike, but that's very short-lived. So people can overcome that. After a year, it's over, that's done. More recently, we had spikes for other reasons. Economic downturns, we had spikes because, conflicts in MENA and the Middle East and North Africa. But if we look at this, we're looking at non-inflation adjusted dollars. And if we look at inflation adjusted dollars, then you see, boy, back then things were actually only spiked up in the 80s and so on because of the Iran-Iraq war. And since then, we had more volatility. But if we look back, volatility historically was not as bad as we make it out to be. And in the recent history, after 2010, 2020, if we look at that, with inflation adjusted prices, things look much smoother. Even recently, yes, there's some spikes, but, things that we can live with. And certainly within that band, 60 to 100 or whatever, it's very tolerable. Tolerable even at 100, and maybe not easy on the Middle East, but countries can survive $60 oil if they have to export because they produce and they live on that. So OPEC could survive for some time, not a very long time, but they'll then work on price controls by cutting production, more or less as they have now. But they're very much against that. It's very difficult for OPEC to implement drastic cuts to raise prices. It's maybe a little bit more difficult to cut production, but it's difficult for them because everybody is trying to maximize their revenues. So everybody, not that they want to cheat, but they want their production and revenues to be maximized.
And how do you see the U.S. trying to postpone interference in terms of the war, being quiet, let's say, to not impact elections? Are they doing that?
Yes, very understandable. What they want to do is push things out into the future so nothing happens now, which is very understandable. People don't want a lot of things happening just before elections. But that is a goal and objective that they would probably have even if we already had elections, and we would like to postpone things to see if they can calm things down. And one of the ways of doing that is by trying to put some pressure, for example, in this case, in Israel and so on. Obviously, the United States is doing some of that. Very difficult to control a country that feels, an existential threat like Israel. But, that's what the United States is doing and should be doing to try to prevent things from getting out of control. But beyond that, there's geopolitical and diplomatic and pressure tactics, yes, but there's also technical, I would say, from a production standpoint, the United States and China have, over the last 20 years, been very aware that the world is going to be living crises, maybe not constantly, but they'll flare up and they go down, they flare up. The United States has SPDR, almost 1 billion barrels is getting there, it's almost 800 now. And China has something similar, half, but they're growing their strategic reserves as well. So that is more effective.
So do you see that both countries, China and the United States, they have enough volumes of storage stocks to face spikes or to
No,
face?
not enough, but big enough that everybody knows that they can be a very moderating influence. Combined,
Mhm.
you use those the SPDR and China's uh, uh, storage in extreme events if prices go up a lot. And if that happens, we have a situation where there are some producing countries that have that leverage to raise production. The United States is one of them. Some Middle Eastern countries could if they wanted to, unless that was part of the geopolitical posturing. So there's very important moderating influences going on because strategic reserves are just that. They're very strategic. And when you have 800 million barrels, you don't take them all at once, but you can complement, 5, 10 million barrels over an extended period of time.
And how do you see the difference between Europe and the United States in terms of supply and prices,
Yeah.
sensitivities
Yeah.
of prices
Yeah.
and supply?
Well, very different situations. Europe is a price taker. They don't have a lot of production. They depend even on LNG and so on. Whereas the United States is in a very comfortable position. They can probably not immediately, but if things got out of control, they could probably increase production by maybe 2, maybe more million barrels a day. People have estimated that because there's a lot of drilled but uncompleted wells. Companies can very short order start plugging away at their wells, and that is a very important moderating influence. Europe doesn't have that. The only thing they can do is try to reduce consumption, and it's very difficult to do that in the middle of winter. So it's a problem to moderate demand, but there is China, and China can do that because of their strategic reserve. They can try to reduce their purchases and use some of the strategic reserve if prices go above 100, for example. And if prices were to come down, they do the opposite. They did it, and they're going to do it again.
Cleveland, Professor, in less than 1 month, United States will have elections, and maybe Biden group and Trump group move between them.
Yeah,
And how do you see the difference between these two guys or two
yeah,
administrations uh,
yeah.
uh, with
We
Trump and
spoke
Biden
about
in terms of
yeah,
war
we
and
spoke
prices?
about that a while back, and I took the maybe unpopular, not very popular view that I don't think there will be that much difference. Everybody says, "Oh, Trump is pro fossil fuels and Kamala is against them." I don't see that.
Yeah.
The momentum in the U.S. is pro production of oil and gas. It's understood that that's an essential part of the economic stability of the world, not just the United States.
And
And it
energy
is,
security, of course.
and the energy security of the United States and the world. And the U.S. has to have that in order to keep Europe stable, for example. Even the United States, well, certainly Texas might welcome higher prices, but the United States as a whole doesn't want to see Europe suffer with $120 petroleum or with triple prices for gas because that destabilizes the situation. It makes Europe more fragile, and Europe has to be strengthened, and that's a geopolitical, diplomatic, strategic posturing that has to be maintained to keep the world in order. And that's very important. And in this case, paradoxically, I think China is in agreement. I wouldn't say Russia is, but China is, because China depends on the rest of the world for its economy to be in good shape. So it doesn't want to rock the boat. Maybe not now. Maybe in some years we might see that change. But it's not rooting for any drastic problems. It's rooting for status quo. Oil prices in this band will suit China perfectly.
Yeah, perfect. That's
Yeah.
a good point that I would like to ask you. I have two points for your objective answers, please.
You
The
always
first,
try to corner me.
yeah, no, the first one, the war. Go or stop? What do you see?
Uh, you know, in my view, is that we're not going to have an all-out war. We will have an extended war. I think it's very difficult
A
to
long
stop.
time
Yeah,
threat.
I think it's very difficult to stop. Like I said, very unlikely that they'll sign a peace agreement tomorrow, next month, by the end of the year. Very unlikely.
Can take
So
years.
yeah, it will take time. So we have to get accustomed to living with conflict and administer conflict. And the way you do that is geopolitical, strategic moves, uh, defending the status quo, energy-wise, trade-wise, even working with China because it's in no one's interest. And just like your program had just the other day, no one benefits from a strike in the eastern coast of the U.S. where China can't export or can't deliver its products to the U.S. The U.S. can't meet its demand. That helps no one. So geopolitically, the big powers, even China and certainly Europe and the U.S., depend on keeping things in working order. So I think this is the way to go. But that means we will live with conflict. And look at this. If we look at recent history, just from 2020 to here, yes, we had the spike from the Ukraine invasion and so on. But since then, the war didn't go away. Russia is still fighting with Ukraine. Ukraine is still attacking Russia, and the prices seem,
Stable.
in a very narrow band. A band like this, you would think that things are rosy, and you would think maybe these spikes are economic news and so on. So the world has indeed grown a little bit more accustomed to
At the
prices.
tail, with OPEC reducing production spontaneously,
Exactly.
could
So
could could it amplify?
yeah,
Yeah.
it's entirely possible that this, could be a damper if we have something that were to move oil prices up very fast. Even Saudi Arabia has an
Yeah.
interest in increasing production. It has spare capacity and could do so. It's in everybody's interest overall in the long term to keep things under control. Certainly, it's not in Hamas's control interest, maybe not in Russia's interest, and so on. But the powers are interested in a more stable world.
Yeah.
They recognize that stability, like we've seen in recent years in oil prices, doesn't mean no conflicts. It means being able to deal with that, having strategic reserves, being flexible with production. The United
Mhm.
States is slowly increasing its production, and it's also able to increase it much more faster if necessary. These are very moderating influences. So if I had to, let's say the war, yes, we will have wars and maybe other wars, but I think we are much more prepared to deal with those than we were in the past. At the beginning of any conflict, yes, you probably have some spikes, but soon the world understands that this can be administered and so on. So, short of an all out war, I expect things to continue like this.
Oh,
Um, I put together, takeaways, and maybe we can discuss some of this. Conflicts, changing production profiles, and we discuss this a lot. I've already been on the record saying, if you look out 5 years or more, Russia is going to lose at least 3 or more million barrels a day.
mhm.
That will have to be administered in the world. Maybe OPEC, maybe Guyana, the U.S., Brazil. Someone will have to take up the slack. Um,
Mhm.
and the drivers of oil prices all tend to act locally. We have local conflicts. When people begin to get scared that they'll
Mhm.
turn into something regional or global, that's when geopolitics comes in. Certainly, we saw, historically, oil prices been very volatile, but adjusted for inflation, maybe we can see extremes now are not
Yeah.
so extreme.
Yeah.
And the recent price history, like we showed, shows that the world is more able to cope with strife and crisis than many people think. There's
And probably
resilience.
we have less demand than capacity to produce today.
Yeah, you see, this is one of the things that people talk about when, oh, we were discussing this. As soon as prices go up $10, there's always someone that says, oh, they'll go up $100 because that's a human tendency. If it starts going up, oh,
Yeah,
it'll go up forever. Well, the best
fear.
remedy for high prices is high prices because that puts a damper on consumption. Certainly in the U.S., gasoline consumption is dependent on price. And in many other regions of the world, you have some effect like that. In China, like we discussed,
Yeah,
can moderate its demand for oil and use some reserves if prices go up. So it's very important that the price mechanism be understood as a very important moderating influence. That's
yeah,
what gives the market resiliency. Because on the upside, the prices also work towards, the shale patch will be very incentivized to produce more if prices get into $100 and so on. And soon enough, prices will go down to 90 and then 80 again. But that's what the market is there to do. And we have to believe in it. And that's, in fact, what is happening.
yeah,
Despite people saying, oh, we have to get rid of oil and hydrocarbons.
yeah.
But right now, oil markets and even gas markets through LNG are very global and they work very well, actually.
Mhm.
Yeah, and of course, the demand elasticity and supply
Yeah,
elasticity is what works to help balance markets. And we have to
yeah,
understand that. To say that oil prices are going to go to 150, it's meaningless unless you understand what's going to happen with demand and what's going to happen to supply, you know, to bring those things back into balance. Um, and the fact that the United States has that capacity, like Saudi Arabia, to increase production 1, 2, maybe 3 million barrels a day, depends how drastic the need is. But it's
yeah,
there. And we have, as we've discussed in other programs, we have to understand the world is changing. Oil production is shifting around the world. There's going to be more oil production even in the United States from the Gulf of Mexico. Certainly Guyana and in a couple of years even Suriname will be big players. Brazil is increasing its production steadily. People don't pay attention because it has been a very steady increase, but it's very significant. We were at 3 million barrels a while back, and now we're pushing
yeah.
more and more.
It's a strong
Uh,
production. Yeah,
and this is happening in other countries, niche markets, I say. A couple countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, even China is increasing its production a little bit. They have to for energy security reasons,
yeah,
even if it's very difficult for them. And certainly the demand flexibility is also a very important part of keeping markets balanced. So, I keep forecasting that less drastic price movements I foresee than these pundits
yeah,
that are
yeah.
throwing.
But of course, I need to pressure you at the corner this time. So give me some predictions for the next month and next year.
Uh,
80, 100, 200. What do
until
you
the
see?
until the end of the year, I don't think we're going to go above 100. Uh, Next year, if we have a spike, we might be spiking up over 100, but we'll be in that band of 70 to 90.
70 to 90. Okay. You are moving your thoughts based on the capacity to produce more than the demand.
And the fact that it is relatively quick. A while back, we were saying, oh, if we have to increase production, that'll take 6 months or 9 months. No, nowadays the shale patch can act very fast, and Saudi Arabia can act very fast, and the SPDR and the Chinese storage can also be brought on stream very fast. So when you have that quick response, prices cannot stay up very long. I can say
That's right.
spike because a trader might jump it up, but not staying up there for a
Yeah,
month or two and so on because
yeah.
people see that the world is reacting to that. Very important.
Yeah, God save us. So we are, we are in a good shape.
Actually, the markets are saving us, but
Yeah, the
that's
markets say, yeah, yeah, markets are saving us. Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much, Professor Cleveland Jones.
Fine. It was fun.
It's a great pleasure.